This lesson is create a base controller class to reduce duplicate code. The objectives for this lesson are to reduce duplicate code by creating our own controller base class and moving things like exception handling and serializing objects into this base class. And then as we go throughout the course, we'll add more and more things to this controller base class. As we've seen, controller base is Microsoft's controller base class that all your controllers must inherit from. We're going to create our own controller base API class that inherits from controller base. So as long as we use that in all of our controllers, it's fine because we're still inheriting from Microsoft. But we can then take any of our common code and properties and put it into this class. The properties that we might add would be things like the info message and the error log message that we did in the last lesson. We might add our iLogger, and we'd have a property maybe for entity as JSON. That's automatically is serialized, right? When we have our product class or a customer class and we want to then put that into our error log, this property could actually hold that data. Then we might have a couple of methods like handle exception and this method called serialize entity to place the data that we serialize into that entity as JSON property. Let's take a look at creating this base controller. Right mouse click on the project and let's add a new folder that we're going to call base classes. Right mouse click on the base classes folder and let's add a class called controller base API. Now this class we're going to start building up little by little. We'll start out here with the public class definition, controller base API, that inherits from controller base. Make sure you don't forget that. Then we're going to add a protected read-only iLogger. We'll have a public constructor here called controller base API into which we will inject this iLogger. And we'll also set up an info message and an error log message property at this time. Let's now go over to our product controller class. And now, instead of controller base, let's inherit from controller base API. Now, obviously, it's not going to come up right away, right? Because we need to add a using. So we'll let Visual Studio add that using statement for us. Now, the logger, this we don't need our private read-only variable here or here. Instead, we're going to grab it from here, but then we're just going to pass it straight down to the base class like so. So there we've modified our controller to inherit from the new base class and pass the data that we inject into here down to the base controller class. Now we can do this with other ones as well, like the log test controller, right? We could do the same thing. We could inherit from the controller base API here. We could remove the logger from here and just pass that straight on down to the base class, eliminating the need to set it ourselves. Now let's just make sure everything will still compile by doing a build solution, and no issues have been found, and the rebuild all has succeeded. Do you know why you should subscribe to YouTube channels? You'll get notifications when new videos appear. You'll get recommendations for related channels. It helps the channel grow, which allows me to create more videos for you. It helps attract others to my channel. Your like helps others find videos that are good. So please take the time to like and subscribe to my channel, Paul.About. Remember in the previous lesson, in the catch block, I was building up this message variable, and it had pretty generic code in it. That's an ideal candidate for something that we could now move down into our base class. So let's create an exception handling method. In our controller base API class, I'm going to add an overload of a handle exception method. The first overload passes in the exception, an info message, and an error message, and then sets the properties on this class. It then calls the next overload, handle exception, passing in that exception, and from here, I use the info message to build the status 500 that I send back to the caller. Then, if you remember, I had a message and a source that we'll see in a minute in the product controller, and I built those up. I'm going to add those on to whatever else is on that error log message, and that's what I will then write out to our log file. So let's go over to our product controller and let's make some changes. So instead of using this local variable here, I'll just use info message. I'm inheriting from that class. I might as well take advantage of these things. Then down in the catch block, I can change a lot of this to be much simpler because all of this code now just kind of goes away. And now I can do my info message, whatever I want. I can do the same one, the error in the product API, please contact the system administrator. The error log message, I can start out with error in, and then I'm using the actual controller and the method name that I'm in because I want that information. And then it will tack on the message, the source, the stack trace, or whatever else you want. So what's nice is that I'm taking common code that I normally would write from one method to another, and I'm moving it down into the base class. Then I just simply call the ret equals handle exception, IEnumerable product, passing in our exception. So if we run this, we should get pretty much exactly the same thing, right? So we go ahead and try this out. We execute, and we get our response back to the caller. And then in our logs, we should see our log error information, right? It's got the message, it's got the source, and then it has the full stack trace there. Really nice. Let's go ahead and take the exception out now. We don't need to use that anymore, so we won't throw one on purpose. If you remember, we wrote a little code to serialize an object into JSON and gave us back a string. Let's take that and let's add that as a method down in our controller base API class. Back in our controller base API, let's add on a new property called entity as JSON. And let's set that to string.empty in the constructor, just so it has a good initial start value. And then let's add another method down here called serializeEntity, to which you'll pass in some class. We call it entity here. And then we do a try catch, because some objects may not be able to be serialized. So we need to be able to at least try it. And if we get something back, great. Otherwise, in the entity as JSON property, it's going to be called nothing serialized. Otherwise, the serialized version of that particular object, such as the product object, will be in that property. Now let's open up the log test controller and let's find that log product that we wrote here. And remember, I did change this so it is inheriting from the controller base API. So that means that now I can do this. I can say base.serializeEntity, and look at that. I now get the same functionality. But if I ever wanted to change that, maybe change some options on how I serialize, I now only have to do it in one place. And again, just to make sure, you should run this. So we'll try this one out, the log test again, log object, here we go. We execute, and we come over here to our log file, and it's still running. Let's go ahead and stop it from running. And when we come all the way down here to the bottom, we should still see our product right there. In this lesson, we saw that having your own base controller class can help you eliminate duplicate code. We added exception handling, the logging, and the serialization of objects down in ours, but it gives you a lot of flexibility to add more common code later, and I'm sure we'll see a couple more things before this course is done. Coming up next, reading configuration settings efficiently.